everybody who's already got logged on. We have quite a few people to log on tonight, probably in excess of 100. So we will wait for a while just to make certain that we get a reasonable start date for people. We've got about 50 logged on at the moment, so we'll just give it a couple of minutes and go from there. Right. So numbers are building. We're up to 60, which is good. If the numbers do settle, we'll make a start because we are time limited. Still going up, so that's good. Yeah, still going up. That's even better. I think once we get past the 1 minute mark, we'll make a start. Okay, I think we will make a start now because we want Lauren to have as much time as possible to tell us her wonderful stories and you to ask as many questions as possible. So, right, just to give you an intro, this is our first webinar for 2025, and most of you will know that I'm Bill Stockdale from Thornton Street History Group. Tonight we're really pleased to welcome back Dr. Lauren McIntyre. You may remember Lauren did something for us earlier on in the year. And tonight Lauren's going to be talking about the All Saints Anchoress and Osteobiography, which sounds really, really good. As always, questions, please put them into the Q&A box. Don't use chat as we are very time limited. We may not be able to answer every question, but we'll do our very, very best. Anyway, enough from me, and I'm going to hand you over straight away now to Lauren. Okay, Lauren.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me back. So, if you don't already know me, so I'm Lauren McIntyre. In my day job, I'm an osteoarchaeologist at Oxford Archaeology, but the subject I'm going to talk to you about today is actually about some personal research that I did off the back of an excavation from quite a number of years ago when I worked for a different company. So I'm going to be talking about one skeleton in particular that we excavated from All Saints Fishergate Church in York at the York Barbican. So a preliminary explanation for this unusual burial that I'm going to talk about is that we might have found the skeleton of a woman called Lady Isabel German, who was a well-known medieval anchoress who is thought to have lived at this church in the 15th century. And so this study that I've done explores the possibility that the skeleton is actually this person. So obviously I'm going to get into that in just a second. I'm going to turn off my video just so that you don't have to look at my face and you can concentrate on the slides. And yeah, we'll get going. So just a little warning before we get started. I'm an osteologist. This presentation is going to feature images of human skeletal remains, just in case that's something that people don't actually want to view. Moving on from this. So before I get to the skeleton itself, I wanted to give you a little bit of background information about the site and about how the project came about. So these photos are from about 2007, so it's quite a while ago. Back at that time, I was actually working as a field archaeologist. I'd only just qualified as an osteoarchaeologist, and I was still struggling to find a job looking at bones. So I was actually working for a company called On-Site Archaeology that's based in York. And amongst the various sites that I worked at while I was under the employment of OSA, I worked at the York Barbican, which you can see there up on the top right. Now, I'll just change slides. So here you can see where the red star is. That's where the actual site was. You can see that there on Google Maps. You can see it's right next to the York Barbican, which is actually still there. Now, at that time in 2007, there was an idea that the whole Barbican complex was actually going to be demolished and it was going to get turned into a housing estate. So there'd been various bits of archaeological work done over the area. There was an evaluation. The main excavation that we were doing was just this little block on the corner of Kent Street and Fawcett Street. It was anticipated that this medieval church foundation may have been there. but people weren't 100% sure. We knew at the time that there was a lot of Roman archaeology in the area, and so basically the whole area needed excavating so the development could go ahead. As it turned out, because of the financial crash of 2007, 2008, the development never went ahead. That's why the houses were never built and why the Barbican actually still stands. But anyway, so just to give you a little bit more background information on the site. So you can't see the exact location of the site on this particular map, but you can see All Saints Fishergate Parish outlined just at the bottom right of that map image. So there's not actually very much documentary evidence about the site itself. What information we do have tends to relate to the medieval church of All Saints Fishergate. So the earliest known reference to this dates somewhere between 1091 and 1095 from the Domesday Book. And in here it states that the church was actually given to Whitby Abbey on the condition that the monks from the mother house would live there and also pray for the soul of William II and all of his successors. Now, we know that burials are recorded as taking place in this parish churchyard until sometime in the 15th century. Then we've got some records that indicate that the All Saints parish was actually united with St Denis Wormgate, and this dates to about 1548. Now, St Denis Wormgate, you can see just to the north of All Saints Fishergate. You know, the parishes don't even touch. So for whatever reason, this never actually happened. Maybe it was because they were a little bit further away. Who knows? But anyway, that never came to pass. But in 1586, All Saints was actually combined with St Lawrence's parish, which you can see is just adjacent on the right-hand side of the image. And after they become combined, the precise fate of the church is really unknown. And this is where the history of the church actually gets a bit hazy. So by the time we get to 1610, so looking at the John Speed 1610 map of York, there is actually a unlabeled building in the location of All Saints Church. Now, I actually couldn't get hold of the 1610 map for this project. What you're looking at now is a 1611 map. And if I just click again, this is roughly where our site is. And you can see that there is no building by 1611. So they'd marked it on the 1610 map, but not on the 1611 one. It's presumed that that building on the 1610 map is All Saints Church. There's no indication on that map whether or not it's still in use. The fact that it's not on the 1611 one suggests probably not. And by this point, it seems the area is just shown as agricultural land. So it means there probably wasn't a church there anymore. By the time we get to like the 17th and 18th century, again, you can see it's just agricultural land. There's not really anything there. There's nothing, like not even any indication that there's ruins or anything that could be All Saints Church. And then we get through to a little later to the 19th century, where the whole area is actually covered in a cattle market. So this cattle market is actually built in 1826 along modern day Kent Street. That's where you can see the site is there. Again, you can see now that we're right on the corner of what's in the modern period is called Kent Street and Fawcett Street. It's got a slightly different name just on there. I think it says Heslington Road. Now, it is recorded in some newspapers from the time that there were human bones actually discovered when the cattle market was being constructed. And we don't know exactly where these bones came from, but you can see on the map on the side that the cattle market is also noted as being the site of All Saints Church. So even though there wasn't a lot of information about the church, there was still sort of like a vague oral record perhaps that the church has existed in that vicinity at some point. So this cattle market continued to cover this area of land until the construction of the Barbican Leisure Centre, which happened in 1987. And when the Barbican Centre was built, again, human skeletons were reportedly found. So you're starting to build up a picture that maybe there is still like a graveyard in the area. And this whole site remained covered by the leisure centre buildings and associated car park until archaeological investigations began in 2003 for this potential housing development. So that takes us up to 2007 when I came on scene and was working on the site. And you can see here a couple of images of the excavation itself. So most of the archaeological deposits that we found on the site were actually pertaining to the lost medieval All Saints Church and its associated parish cemetery. So you can see there's a picture of the cobble church foundation. So we had most of the church. It was just the south side that was beyond the limit that we were allowed to excavate to, because obviously that's like going under the pavement and the road. So we had the majority of the church. There were 547 medieval skeletons, some of which you can see being excavated there. You can also see some features in the top, the sort of westernmost room of the church there. Now, we did think that these might be a series of beam slots that possibly were for an earlier wooden church on the same location. As well as all the medieval archaeology, we also had a handful of Roman burials. I think it was about 7. There were some bits and bobs of cremated bone, which we never had dated, but I'd put money on them being Roman as well. And we also had 10 post-medieval mass graves containing 113 individuals that we thought probably dated to the Civil War and the 1644 Siege of York. Unfortunately, that is a completely different story for another day. I'm not going to have time to even mention that again. But yeah, you can see that we were there for nearly a year, I think it was, and we found a hell of a lot of stuff. And so it's kind of at this point that Graham Bruce, who you saw on the previous slide, he's the site director from On-Site Archaeology. He had been doing a little bit of historical research into the site, and he uncovered a really teeny tiny bit of information that said that an Anchoress was supposed to have lived in All Saints Church at some point during the medieval period. This is super interesting. I had never ever heard of an Anchoress before or what that might be. And even now when I talk to people about it, quite a lot of people have never even heard of this. So I thought I'd just give you guys a little bit of information about what an Anchoress is. So I hope you can see all this and that my various things that I've got on the screen are not blocking your view of the slide. But for anybody who's not familiar with it, being an anchoress or an anchorite, if you were a male, because you could have male and female ones, they were kind of like religious recluses. And it turns out this was a really, really widespread practice in the Middle Ages. It sort of peaked in popularity through the 13th and 14th centuries. By the 15th century, it's pretty much finished and nobody was doing it anymore. The most famous anchoress was Julian of Norwich. And there was actually quite a formal process that you had to go through in order to become an anchoress. I think that there's been a bit of a prevailing idea that it was something that was used to sort of punish people or whatever, like force them into being religious and stuff. But actually, you had to apply to the local bishop and be able to demonstrate that you were of like sound moral character and like you were a spiritual enough person to be able to seriously undertake this role. You also had to be able to demonstrate that you could financially provide for yourself, whether or not that's that you had enough money to support yourself for the entire time that you were an anchoress, or whether you were confident that the local community would actually donate enough money to pay for your upkeep and hopefully contribute a bit towards the church as well. So you'd apply to your local bishop. They would decide whether they were going to accept you or not. And then if they did accept you, then you would undergo an enclosure ceremony that was probably conducted by this local bishop, or it could be by the local priest, and it would be done in front of anybody from the parish who wanted to go. It was a very public event. And the ceremony itself sort of acted almost as a symbolic funeral in a way, whereby there'd be lots of singing, lots of chanting, there'd be various stuff going off, and eventually you would be enclosed in your cell that you were going to be living in for the rest of your life. And when I say enclosed, in some circumstances, it's thought that the anchoress was actually bricked up into the room that they were going to be living in. I'm going to talk about some things later on that does demonstrate that this wasn't actually the case all the time, but that's kind of like the idea. And then once you'd been enclosed, whether being bricked up or not, your role within the community was then a very prominent one. You were actually seen as sort of like a living saint or some sort of profit within the local community attached to your parish church. And the people living in the parish could then pay the church to so that they could go and ask the anchoress for spiritual advice. So you could pay the church so that the anchoress would say prayers for them, to do things like help you spend or help somebody spend less time in purgatory, all sorts of things. So they did actually fulfill quite an important role. Now, in order to be an anchoress, I said you had to be of a good moral character and you had to be considered to be spiritually pure. And in order to help you with this, there was a book written called The Anchorine Vis, which is a set of spiritual and practical guidelines that the anchoress could live by. Now, I don't think we know exactly who wrote this. There's some evidence that suggests there was like a Belgian bishop that wrote it in the 13th century or something, but it's never actually been attributed to like one specific person. And there's several chapters in the book. Most of them discuss the spiritual rules that you have to adhere to in order to be a good anchoress. And these are considered the like most important thing that you have to be able to stick to. There is one chapter that's on practical guidelines, but it seems that it even says in the book that these are more flexible. It kind of says if you can adhere to these, if you want to adhere to these, then great. But some of them are quite vague, and like I said, there's lots of flexibility. It doesn't really seem to matter if you can't do all of the practical stuff. A copy of one of these books was actually on display in the British Library up until about the end of March this year, I think it was. So yeah, there's still like copies of it kicking around now as well that you can see, and you can also, if you Google Anchorine Vis, there's like translations of it online that you can see as well. So in terms of your sort of day-to-day life as anchoress, you would probably live either within a room in the church, in a cell, or somewhere like in the churchyard. Sometimes these things are called anchor holds. Preferentially, they should be very close to, or at least in view of, the high altar. So I think the idea in a lot of cases is that you would be behind the high altar, and then there'd be like a little squint, so like a little window that the anchoress could look through, so she could see the high altar. The proximity to the high altar is actually really important because it's a symbol of like holiness. And historical evidence for these anchor holds shows that these could just be a room within the church, or it could be something that was sort of built onto the side of the church, like a little extension. And in some cases, we know that people were actually living in completely separate buildings, but just like somewhere within the churchyard. And there's a couple of interesting points that are brought up in these practical guidelines as well. Like one of the things that I found out about was that the guidance recommends one of the things that an anchoress can do to sort of help pass the time is that she can dig her own grave with her hands, which sounds completely nuts to us. But apparently this helps the anchoress to contemplate their own mortality and the suffering of Christ as well. There's several things that you can and can't do as well. Like you're allowed to mend church vestments and clothes for poor people, but you're not allowed to speak to anybody face to face. Like there's got to always be a covering on your window if somebody comes to see you, because it that removes any temptation for you, like seeing another person. Like you're not going to be tempted into sin in any way. They're also allowed to keep a pet cat, which I think is quite cool. The more that I actually read about what you can and can't do when you're an anchoress, I think it might have been quite an attractive prospect to some women in the Middle Ages, but that's maybe just me. So these are a couple of examples of anchor holds that you can still see today. There's numerous ones around the country. Some of them are reconstructions. I think the one on the left in Cambridgeshire, I think that probably is like a Victorian reconstruction that's built like on the site of maybe the original medieval one. The one on the right in Skipton is apparently original. There's various ones you can go and see. Sometimes you might just see on the outside wall of a church, you might see like a scar from where there used to be one, but it isn't there anymore. This is like a whole rabbit hole that you can go down looking for cells that anchoresses used to live in. Anyway, so now I've kind of hopefully given you a pot of history of the site. and a little bit about Anchoresses. And so I'm going to move on to discuss the main focus of the presentation. So here is our skeleton, our person in question, skeleton 3870, which was discovered in the apse of the church foundation. So if you remember that that cobbled church foundation that I showed you a few slides ago, the apse is actually the semicircular room that was at the bottom of the slide, so the east end of the church. So you can see an image of the skeleton here. It was buried supine, so on its back, in a very tightly crouched position, with the knees drawn all the way up to the chest. Now, most of the skull was actually absent, and that's because you may be able to see there's a few teeny tiny bones up at sort of the roughly at the head end of the burial. That's because there was a later baby burial put in there. That was probably actually put in after the Church of Great Use, which is interesting in itself. But unfortunately, that burial of the baby had meant that the skull had been damaged and lost. So you can see the grave itself is actually quite large. It's 1 meter 28 long, it's 76 centimeters wide, and it's about 25 centimeters deep. Obviously, we don't know the original depth because of the truncation from the cattle market. It's a really large and unusually shaped grave, and the position of the skeleton within it is also unusual. Tightly crouched burials like this are more characteristic of much earlier time periods, so various points in prehistory, sometimes occasionally Saxon graves you might find burials in this position. By the time we get through to the medieval period, where you're having Christian burials, they more often than not tend to be laid out on their backs, fully extended, like with their legs out in front of them, maybe in a coffin or a shroud or something like that. There was no evidence of a coffin in this grave, but I mean, that's not really that surprising considering the burial position. There was no evidence of grave goods. We didn't have any shroud pins. And this grave that you can see on the slide is actually the real shape of the original grave. This is not that the archaeologist overcut it. It was actually this shape and size, which probably begs a question as well, like what was in there? Why was it that big? Was there something organic in there that we've lost, that we don't have any trace of anymore? Or was it just built big for some reason that we don't know about? So already pretty mysterious. And because of various problems associated with the financial crash and obviously cancellation of the development, there were various funding issues with this project. And at one point it was looking like the skeletons, even though they'd all been lifted out of the ground, like they were never going to, like the client was never going to pay for them to be analysed. But fortunately, Andrew Chamberlain, who was then at the University of Sheffield, managed to step in, managed to procure some Arts and Humanities Research Council funding in 2009. And that funding actually paid for me to spend a year analysing all the skeletons from the site. So there was over 600 in all, between the Roman, medieval and post-medieval skeletons. So you can probably imagine that I also had to write a report in that time. So there wasn't like a huge amount of time to spend on this one individual. It was a very rapid analysis of all the individuals from the site. And then I wrote up the report and completed that in 2010. So the results of the very basic analysis were this. The skeleton looked like it was likely to be female. The age at death was somewhere between 30 and 50 years, but I couldn't really narrow it down any further. There was quite a lot of pathology, including something that at the time I thought was perhaps syphilis, and I'll come back to this later. And basically, this sort of the preliminary osteological data, especially concerning, the age and the sex of the individual, plus the fact that the skeleton's located in this prestigious burial location in the church apse, which is right behind the church altar, the high altar, did start to make us think, could this be the Anchoress? So the next logical thing to do was to try and get a date on this individual. So here is the C14 result. So again, this C14, we managed to get NERC funding from the British Geological Survey in 2010. This was the radiocarbon data that we got on that skeleton. And basically, don't worry if you can't read radiocarbon outputs, it's fine. basically it's looking like this individual dates to the early to late 15th century. So kind of right ballpark, um, but things kind of stalled there, unfortunately. Again, sort of funding problems and whatnot. So the funding for the AHRC project ended. The report was finished and sent off. I got waylaid by various other things like doing a PhD and having a job and getting married and stuff. So I didn't really get around to doing any more work on this individual for quite a long time. And then 2018 rolled around, and I'd actually just been mentioning this case in passing to a colleague at, I think it was a museum exhibition, and she persuaded me that I should probably apply for some more funding to do some further work because it's a really interesting case. So what I did was I applied for funding to the British Association for Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology, of which I am a member. I've also served on a committee, which has nothing to do with me getting funded, I should say. I had to go through the proper application process like everyone else. And I was really lucky to get the funding. And the basic aims of this project are on the slide. I wanted to do some more detailed osteological analysis to try and refine the age and sex of the individual if I could, do a bit of metrical analysis, definitely some more pathological analysis because there's a lot going on. Re-examine C14 date, do some isotope analysis and maybe some historical research. And the overall thrust of the project was, can we say conclusively if this is the All Saints Anchoress? So it's a bit of a tall order, you might think. And so the rest of my talk is pretty much going to focus on the results of the 2018 to 2020 study. Did get slightly slowed down right at the end by COVID, I should say, but it all came together in the end. So here you can see some more results from my more detailed osteological analysis. Oh, the skeleton is currently housed at the University of Sheffield, I should say, as part of their research collection with all the other skeletons from that site. So luckily I live in Sheffield, so it was quite easy for me to get in touch with the department and arrange access. So after doing some full osteological analysis, we could see that the skeleton was about 75% complete. It was very fragmented, which made things quite difficult. The main part of the individual that was missing was that skull that we've already talked about. The age I could not refine down any further than 30 to 50 years. And the reason for that was, even though a lot of the bits were there that I needed to look at in order to get a good age estimation, the skeleton was so pathological that there were pathological changes to the bones that you use for aging, which made that much more difficult. So unfortunately, that has to sort of stand where it is. Good news is it is very much looking like the individual's female. She wasn't super tall. She's only about 5'3", but that's probably about normal for the medieval period anyway. We had her lower jaw, her mandible, so we were able to get some information on dental pathology. So she got quite a bit of mineralized tooth plaque, and she'd also got periodontal disease. And then in terms of the skeletal pathology, she got osteoarthritis. She definitely got osteoporosis. Her bones are so light in weight, and you can see that the trabecular structure is really thinned. So she's definitely not having a good time with that. A lot of the joints had got signs of either septic or pyogenic arthritis. It's really difficult to distinguish between those two things when you've only got the dry bones, so I've had to kind of like leave that there. And as I thought in the original analysis, there was some very, very convincing signs of tertiary acquired syphilis. And you can see on the slide there that those gummatous lesions, these are actually, the left one is on the distal left humerus, which is sort of like the elbow end of your upper arm bone. And then the other lesion on the right is from the middle of the left thigh. And there were multiple lesions like this all over the skeleton, and they are extremely characteristic of syphilis. this woman was not a well woman. Everywhere where she would have had one of these lesions, like the ones that you can see on the slide, she would have had like a big open wound that was probably the reason that these types of lesions form is to allow pus drainage out of the center of the bone. So you can see that if she's got these all over her body, it's not a good situation. Like, she was not very well at all. So for anybody who's interested in syphilis, because I really am, it's a very interesting disease. Um, Acquired syphilis, because there is a congenital version, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Acquired syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and it is the first disease to be widely recognized as a disease that is transmitted sexually. So if you catch this disease, there's 4 stages of the infection that you go through. The initial stage is that you develop something called a chancre, which is a itchy skin ulceration that develops at the site where the infection was contracted. And the disease is basically you get it from coming into contact with infected fluids. At the same time as you get the chancre, you will also get a rash on your hands and feet. And you probably also get sores around your mouth and also on your genitals. This is all pretty gross, but eventually these 2 symptoms will disappear of their own accord. And this is a point where people quite often think it's just gone and they've got better, even if they've not had any treatment. And you think, yes, all right, syphilis has gone, brilliant. The problem is that what this means is you've just entered the latent period, which is where you still have the disease and you can still infect other people, but you just don't have any outward symptoms. Unfortunately, this is where things get quite scary, because by the time you get to stage 4, which is tertiary syphilis, like, this can develop up to several decades after you were initially infected. So you can have your latent period with no symptoms for like 20, 30, 40 years. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the tertiary stage just erupts in your system. And this is when you start to get these gummatous lesions, like the ones that I showed you on the last slide, which are like soft, non-cancerous growths that you can get on the skin, but you also get them on the bones. You get them in your organs, particularly your liver's quite susceptible to these things. Eventually, you will develop neurological problems, neurosyphilis, which is when, people do say, if you've got syphilis, eventually you go mad. Well, that's the neurosyphilis. You can get heart problems from it as well. It's a really horrible disease. And it's pretty scary to think that before 1943, there was no actual successful treatment for syphilis. It was treated with mercury. So you would be given mercury to either rub on the area that was giving you trouble, or you could take it orally. Again, don't recommend that. Don't take any mercury, please. It will not fix anything. But then in 1943, it was discovered that syphilis is actually really easy to treat with penicillin. So, if you do think you might have got some syphilis, please just do go see your GP. It's really easy to sort out, it turns out. Now, of course, since people have identified the cause of syphilis, it's had really strong associations with things like a lack of morality and sort of indecency, sin, all that kind of stuff. And even in the modern period, there's a huge stigma associated with it as a disease. And there's been a long assumption that people that have got syphilis, particularly women, if you get syphilis, it means that, like, you're of poor character, you've got loose morals, you could be a sex worker, all these kinds of things. This is like, it's a very pervasive thought even nowadays. And the reason that I'm mentioning all this is because when we think back to our skeleton and the severity of the disease that she's got, and then all these kind of like associations with the disease, historical associations of the disease, would an important religious figure like an Anchoress be likely to have got such a severe manifestation of a sexually transmitted disease like this? Like, it's a really interesting question. And it's not one that I'm going to answer now. I'm going to let you think about it for a little while I talk about something else, but I will come back to it shortly. So just moving on from syphilis. I'm going to talk a little bit about stable isotopes and the isotopic analysis that I was undertaking for this project. So, for anybody who doesn't know, I will explain what stable isotopes are, but basically I took a fragment of rib and fibula, which is lower leg bone, to which we can analyze the isotopes in those to look at diet. And we also took a tooth so that we could look for evidence of childhood origin. I am not an isotope person. I can take the samples, but I need to send them to an isotope specialist. So I actually sent them to the University of Durham, and they were analysed by Professor Janet Montgomery and her team, who basically they're sort of the most eminent isotope specialists in the UK. So I was very glad to be able to work with those guys. Now, again, for anybody who's not familiar, stable isotopes, they're non-radioactive atoms, and the way that stable isotope analysis works is based on the principle of you are what you eat. So the ratio of the different isotopes that we see in our results are determined by what a person has eaten and drank during their lifetime. And so in order to examine diet, we want to look at carbon and nitrogen isotopes, typically nitrogen 15 and carbon 13. And again, without going too much into it, all you really need to know is that the ratios of these two isotopes that you will see in your bones will help you to determine what sort of diet a person had. So if they've got like the higher the nitrogen value, the more likely that the person has been eating meat. And you get a slightly different signature for terrestrial proteins. So proteins that come from animals that live on land, they give off a different signature to proteins from animals that come from the sea. I should say you can't actually distinguish between freshwater fish and marine fish. So if somebody is eating freshwater fish, it'll come out looking like terrestrial, like land mammals and stuff like that. We can also tell what types of plants people are eating. So C3 plants are things, they're like typical European plants that we'd have for most of sort of British prehistory and history. So things like oats, barley, wheat, that kind of thing. C4 plants only get introduced to Europe later on. They're things like maize and corn that we more typically get growing in places like North America, and then they get brought over to Europe in the post-medieval period. So you wouldn't expect to see things like C4 results in earlier skeletons, for example. So hopefully that makes sense. There's isotopes super complicated. And I'm not going to bang on about this too much because I know it's complicated. But this is our results. So you can see the red results are skeleton 3870. This is plotted against where we'd expect various types of diet to be. So somebody that is eating herbivores, somebody that's eating omnivorous animals, and then somebody who's eating marine animals. The other grey dots on here you can see are other later medieval skeletons that had already been sampled from elsewhere in Fishergate, so the same region that our skeleton's from. And what these results basically show is that our skeleton, like most people in the medieval period, had a mixed diet. The 3 different samples that we sent off gave slightly different results. Now, the fibula, which is the leg bone, is reflective of diet earlier in life. And you can see the rib, I should say, because of some factors to do with like how quickly the cells in the rib bones turn over, they're a bit quicker. The rib results are reflective of later life. So what we can see is that diet has changed slightly over the life course, and it's gone from having basically no fish in it to having a smaller component of fish. So which is quite interesting. So we've got somebody they're a mixed diet, but their diet changes over time. And this is basically saying what I've already said. So earlier in life, this person would have been eating a mixed diet with vegetables, probably some meat and dairy, but no seafood. That's another thing. Dairy, because things like milk and eggs and things like that come from terrestrial animals. We also can't distinguish between the meat from these animals and the dairy products from those same animals. So meat and dairy is kind of like it's put together in these type of results. And then we can see later in life, we've got a mixed diet with vegetables, meat, and dairy, plus a small amount of seafood. And when we look at this in a broader context, we're looking at somebody who's got an average medieval diet. And what we can say about medieval diet, because there's been quite a lot of isotope studies on medieval diet, plus there's quite a lot of medieval texts that talk about these things as well. And we can see from all these pieces of evidence that only people at the opposite ends of the socioeconomic scale tend to have very different diets. So very poor people, they don't tend to eat any seafood at all, no fish. They'll probably eat a lot less meat. We can tell if somebody's been eating a totally vegetarian diet, and sometimes we see that quite a lot with poorer populations from the medieval period. And then when you get very rich populations, they're eating loads and loads of seafood. Like they're eating seafood like it's going out of fashion. So these two types of populations give like very, very extreme results, and usually we'd expect everyone else to sort of sit somewhere in the middle, and that's where our skeleton falls. It falls between, it's, as I say, it's a very average looking medieval diet. Now, going on to stable isotopes we can use to examine childhood origin and migration. These kind of work on the same principle as the carbon and nitrogen, like they're reflective of things that you've been ingesting into your system. To look at where somebody came from and where they grew up as a child, we want to look at strontium and oxygen isotopes. And that's because the strontium is a reflection of local geology. And the principle for this is you're living in an area that's got a certain type of geology. You're more likely than not going to be growing your food, so your plants and things like that, and grazing your animals in a local area. And so the plants and animals are uptaking the strontium isotopes from the ground, and then you're eating the animals and the plants, so the strontium is then reflected in your system. And it's the same kind of thing with oxygen, except that that's a reflection of local groundwater, because again, you're going to be drinking water from a local source. These types of analyses would not work today because we're getting food imported from all over the place, and we're drinking water that's come from God knows where miles away. But it is a useful tool for people who were probably eating and drinking all like from local sources. And so what we then do is compare the results of the isotopes with where the person was buried. So we can see then evidence of migration. So the strontium and oxygen isotopes that we measure are actually taken from the teeth. That's because teeth finish developing by the time you're about 23, and then they don't change. Whereas bones can like change and remodel, and you have that bone turnover that I mentioned earlier. Teeth, once they finish forming, they're locked in, and those isotopes are locked in there. So when we measure isotopes from teeth, they only tell us up to the first 23 years of life, depending on what tooth you use, because all your different teeth, like each specific tooth, will finish developing at a different time. Everybody knows like which teeth come through first, like when you're a kid and stuff. And so we can get quite a specific period of time that somebody was in a particular place. And so if the strontium and oxygen results match the region that the burial was found in, then we'd say that that person's probably local and they've probably not gone very far in their life. Whereas if the burial is actually somewhere way away from where the strontium and oxygen are reflective of, then we can say that they moved at some point since their childhood. I hope this all makes sense. Please do ask questions later if it doesn't. So again, I won't bang on too much about this because it's super complicated. But what you can see on this slide is that the coloured bands, the blue, green, and yellow, are generally where we'd expect the results of strontium and oxygen analysis to fall for somebody from Britain. So you can see we've got Eastern Britain on the left and Western Britain on the right. And if the skeleton was going to be local, so local to the Vale of York, I should say, then they should fall between those two red lines, because that's what the strontium ratio is that we'd expect for that region. And you can see that our skeleton falls above that. So what this is actually telling us is that this skeleton did probably grow up in Britain, but not in the Vale of York. And so what we've got to do then is look at places elsewhere that could give us these same strontium and oxygen, like this same combination of ratios. So regions that could provide these values include areas to the north and west of York, so places like North Yorkshire, Yorkshire Dales, maybe North East England. Devon and Cornwall also give those same results, and also Wales. So what that's telling us is that our skeleton isn't local to York. She's probably lived in one of these places and then travelled to York at some point after childhood. And that also makes you think about the diet as well. Like, is the reason that for the dietary change because she grew up somewhere else where there was no access to fish, and then by the time she got to York, there was access to seafood. Another thing that Janet suggested we could do to try and refine this a bit further was look at lead isotopes. I felt like I knew even less about these than I did about the other sorts, but we can use them to refine strontium and oxygen signatures by comparing lead signature to natural lead ores from different places in the UK. So these are mainly divided into like the north and south of Britain and Wales. Another thing you can also do is measure the level of natural exposure to lead in that person. And what that'll tell you is if the person has got really high lead levels in their system, they probably grew up somewhere more urban, because it's urban contexts where lead is being like used and processed a lot more. Whereas if somebody's got a really, really low lead level, then that's more consistent with a rural upbringing because people aren't messing about with lead so much. So these were the results, and basically what they tell you is that we're still probably looking at a British upbringing, but we can't rule out an upbringing somewhere in or around the Welsh border. We could probably say the person could also be from the northwest or northeast of England, but we seem to have ruled out that sort of Devon and Cornwall potential. It's not looking like the person's from there at all. And you can see in the graph on the right hand side that the lead levels in this individual are so low that is looking like it's reflective of a less polluted rural environment that this person grew up in. So, moving on. Another thing we need to factor in is we need to factor these isotopes into the radiocarbon date, because the fact that we can see this person has got some fish in their diet might mean that the previous radiocarbon date that we got is actually wrong. And that's because of something called the reservoir effect, where if somebody's been eating fish that's come out of the sea, the carbon that's consumed by animals in the sea is older than the carbon that's consumed by organisms on land. And the upshot of that is that seafood can actually make your C14 date look a lot older than it actually is, which can be problematic when you want to know what date something is. So we have to kind of like throw that out the window and rethink it a little bit. So I had the radiocarbon date remodeled using a worst case scenario. So we used the fishiest result from those isotopes that we got. It was, I should say, I didn't do this either. It's my colleague Tom Booth, who now works at University College London. He's really good at these things, and he came up with the correct model range for me that you can see on the slide. So mid to late 15th century, through any time from then through to early 17th century, which is quite a large date range for the 95% bracket, but the chances are that it probably does fall at the earlier end of that date. There's about a 60% probability that the skeleton dates either mid to late 15th or very early 16th century, which kind of like correlates with the historical records that we've got for when the burial ground was being used anyway. So that's kind of like vaguely where we want it to be, which is encouraging. And then I also said that I wanted to do some historical research, which I did do. And what you are looking at on the slide at the moment is the actual documentary evidence that proves that the Anchoress was at All Saints Church. So I wanted to do some historical research into the actual person, this Lady Isabel, that we knew was living in All Saints Church as an Anchoress. You can see the bit that is highlighted in red is the probate itself. I think you can see here it says Isabel German. That's her name, if you can see where my cursor's going. This is actually currently housed at the Borthwick Institute at the University of York. And I said it's a probate. That is a record that a will was made for the event of her death. It's not the will itself, and there doesn't appear to be a will itself. I think a lot of wills were actually verbal at that time. So the probate is like a record that the will was made, but it isn't the will, if that makes sense. I don't know about you, but I don't speak Latin or read Latin. So fortunately, my lovely friend Julian Mumby, who was head of historic buildings at Oxford Archaeology, does read Latin, and he translated it for me. So you can see here the translation. The probate reads, it's probate of the testament of Mrs. Isabel German, recently recluse of York. The testament of Mistress Isabel German, recently anchorite in the parochial church of All Saints in Fishergate, deceased, was proved on the 13th day of the month of August in the year of our Lord 1448, an administration granted to Robert Smeaton, the named executor of the same will, sworn in the legal form. So yeah, one thing to point out, and this is interesting chatting to Julian about this because he's worked with quite a lot of these types of documents before, is that he didn't think that the date on the probate was actually the date of her death. The wording does kind of make it sound like that, but he seemed to think that that date would be the date that the probate was written, and it's kind of in the event of her being deceased. It just doesn't really come across like that. But we do have some more evidence to suggest that he was right on the next slide. Because as well as Isabel's probate, we also have 7 wills which make bequests to Isabel the Anchoress. And this is people making bequests to her so that they can benefit from her saying prayers for them. And you can see the names and dates of all of them on the slide. One of them is a lady called Marion, who bequeathed a brass pot to Isabel's servant. So we know that she had a servant who was looking after her. And this is something that's mentioned in the Anchoring Vis. You were allowed to have a woman servant who could help you sort of be your day-to-day go-between. So again, it kind of limits that possibility of you sinning with a member of your parish that's coming to see you. There's also a will for Alex Hawksworth, who was apparently Isabel's aunt. And you can see down here that there's a Lord John Scrope who left her some money in 1455, so several years after the date on that probate. I'm presuming that he's not going to be leaving money to her if she's dead. So this is another thing that makes us think that that the date on that probate is the date the probate was written rather than anything else. And so we can see from these wills that Lady Isabel was working as an anchoress at All Saints Church between 1428 and 1455. We don't know the day that she died, but what this tells us is that she was an anchoress for at least 27 years, which is a fair old amount of time, really. And then at this point, I had stopped doing the historical research, and I didn't find any other more evidence pertaining to her. So it's a bit unfortunate. I was hoping I was going to find a little bit more than that, but I mean, what can you do? So that brings me kind of to the final leg of this talk, which is when we start to put all this evidence together, what does it actually tell us? So I think in general, the burial location is probably one of the most compelling bits of evidence. We know from the Anchoress Vis that the closer a burial location is to the high altar, the closer Anchoress is to the high altar, the more desirable. And in general practice, in terms of like church burials, the closer that your burial is to the high altar, the holier and like more desirable the burial location is, and presumably the more expensive it is as well. If somebody's going to be buried in the apse, which is the room right behind the high altar, that would perhaps suggest that this person was of very high social status, probably high economic status, or it might suggest that they're a senior figure in the church hierarchy. Now, at this point in the medieval period, like the late medieval period talking about, it wasn't just clergy that were allowed to be buried in churches. Like people could pay to be buried in there as well. But obviously being buried inside a church at this point is super expensive. So it's only like the richest people in society that would ever have been able to afford this. So yeah, interesting. Then, so whoever this skeleton was, whether or not it was the Anchoress or somebody else, we know that she was probably a very significant person, whether that's somebody who's very significant in the local religious community, or whether she's a super wealthy like church benefactor, or she's got some sort of other significant role in the parish. Um, the lack of historical evidence about Lady Isabel was pretty frustrating, to be honest, and it meant it wasn't really possible to compare like the scientific evidence about where she was born or a kind of a lived experience and like travel and things like that. I wasn't really able to tie it to anything. I was hoping that I'd find some information saying like where Lady Isabel was from and all that kind of stuff. And it just wasn't possible, unfortunately. There was a little bit of dietary information that we could look at because again, the Anchoress has got like some vague dietary recommendations in it. Again, they're not like super great. I went through it like with a fine-tooth comb, and the dietary recommendations are basically that the Anchoress shouldn't be eating meat unless they were ill. They should avoid eating white foods on fasting days. White foods, I think it's meant to mean like dairy and stuff, but again, it's not super specific. It doesn't mention fish at all in there, and again, frustratingly, because these are part of the practical guidelines rather than the spiritual ones, it sort of says, well, it doesn't really matter if you do these anyway. Try your best, but if you can't, it's fine. So the upshot of this is that the diet of the skeleton that we can see from the isotopes, it does broadly fit with these rules. But as I've already said, this all already falls within the sort of normal range for most people in the medieval period anyway. So it's not actually that helpful. Um, yeah, same thing. The fact that she was eating marine foods in later life is probably something that's associated with like the fact that she moved from somewhere where fish wasn't available potentially, so maybe somewhere inland through to somewhere where, I mean, York, you've got all sorts of stuff coming in and out of there and up the river, so there's going to be a lot more access to seafoods in somewhere like York anyway. So yeah. Now, the other question is what about syphilis? It's a very important question. Also, I think very intriguing. So, I've already talked about how traditionally syphilis is associated, well, in especially in the post-medieval period, which is a little bit after this, with sinful behaviors, things like blasphemy, lust, immorality. And it's an interesting question as to whether we would associate this with somebody who had like a senior role within the local religious community and whether or not that would be compatible with life as an anchoress. We know that the various post-medieval negative connotations of syphilis and how people who had it were generally thought to be quite unclean. And we can see that, I mean, syphilis isn't something, it's supposed to have been brought over to Europe with the Columbus expedition. There's a few theories that it might have been in Europe before then, but there's not really any conclusive proof for it. But there is an idea that maybe there was like some version of it that wasn't quite exactly the same that was in Europe before then. Again, the scientific evidence of this is a little bit vague. But what we can say is in the medieval period, in relation to any disease, anything that caused obvious disfigurement or like an obvious sort of visual change, especially facially, was still associated with people being unclean and had a lot of negative connotations. So even if the person, like the skeleton, the person living in the medieval period, had a disease that people didn't recognize as venereal syphilis because maybe it wasn't something that had been around very long. The fact that they'd clearly got all these horrible lesions all over their body and presumably all over their face, because it does tend to affect your cranium first. So if somebody's got these lesions all over their body, they've definitely already got it on the head. So it's interesting to think whether presumably people would associate these sort of disfiguring characteristics and physically obvious disease, they'd still associate it with sin. And so it could be assumed that whatever the identity of this woman was, this visible illness could have left her susceptible to social exclusion, which again makes this burial in this prominent location in the apse even more intriguing. Which then brings us to the anchoring this, which, and when I was reading it, I wasn't really expecting to find this, to be honest. So it was quite something when I found these passages. So the anchoring this describes sickness in a really interesting way, in that it can be caused by one of two things. So if you have sickness that results from your own folly or man's folly, as it's quoted in the book, um, that's a bad thing because it means that you've misbehaved in some way and God is sending sickness to punish you. And this is definitely seen as a bad thing. However, sickness can also be sent by God to help cleanse your soul, and this is seen as being good. So if God's sending you sickness to help cleanse your soul, and it has sort of this like martyr like connotation to it, and it's seen as a really positive thing. So thinking about these things, I think the attitude that people in the parish, whoever this person was, the attitude of people towards the disease experienced by this person would likely depend on the perception of its cause, if that makes sense. And we also have to consider, I already said that if this is indeed venereal syphilis, it can actually remain dormant for several decades, like a really long time, and have no outward expression at all until this tertiary stage sort of remanifests. And so it's perfectly possible that if this was an Anchoress, she could have been enclosed and have had no outward sign of disease. And then 20 years after she was enclosed, all of a sudden she starts getting symptoms. And yeah, we can see that the documentary evidence shows that she was in All Saints for at least 27 years. So again, it's perfectly possible that nobody had any idea that she was sick. And then gradually, as she manifested this disease, maybe it was seen as a good thing being sent by God. Bill, I know that it's just gone half past. I'm nearly done. I'm nearly done. So the final question is, does the skeleton represent the remains of Lady Isabel German? Well, I mean, I will let you make your own mind up. It's still quite uncertain, I think. To conclude, although we've now got a detailed osteological profile of this skeleton, the question of identity is definitely hindered by a lack of information about the Anchoress herself. We can say that the radiocarbon date fits, but it's very broad. The dietary evidence kind of fits, but it also kind of fits with everyone else from that period. Anchoritic lifestyle is pretty flexible. I don't necessarily think the syphilis would have been a barrier to being an Anchoress, and it might have even been seen as a good thing. And then that burial location suggests that she's somebody really important. So I think it is possible that it is the Anchoress. But even after this study, we can't really say either way, I'm afraid. And I will leave it there.
Okay. Well, thanks, Laura. That was absolutely fantastic. Actually, I'm certain you could have given us a little bit more as well. But time is of the essence, unfortunately. To
That's
be very,
totally
very
understandable. I will stop sharing and stick my camera back on.
okay. All right, we're very, very time limited, which is a shame, really. So, sadly, tonight we're just not going to have time for questions. We've just run out of time as far as our allotment is concerned. So again, thank you, Lauren. Absolutely super. Really, really enjoyed that. And if people do have questions, I mean, just ping them off to us. I'll ping them off to Anne, and I'm certain we can send them on to Lauren, and she'll give us an answer which will relate and refer back to you. So
Yeah, can do.
yeah, again, thank you very, very much. I've got to move on quickly now. Our next webinar is on Thursday, the 11th of December, and when we have Alex Sutherland, he's going to talk about barrows to bunkers, and it's the archaeology of Ministry of Defence estate sites. So that should be very, very interesting. Thanks to everybody who's been signed up tonight. I've had a good attendance, so I'm really pleased with that. And thank you for all the donations that you've made. If you have anything more that you can give us, we'd be very, very appreciative to receive it, as we are still self-funding. So, okay, we'll have to leave it at that. I apologise again for not being able to ask Lauren loads and loads of questions.
Oh, I'm sorry for overrunning.
No, it's just it just goes like this sometimes, Lauren. I mean, it was a fascinating subject. And the good thing was that it's local. It's local to us. It's in York, and it's just down the road, and people appreciate that so much. So thank you very much. I'm going to have to say good night to everybody now. So do take care, and thank you very much. Bye.